Martine does a lot of things. A lot of these things revolve around birds and threatened birds and oftentimes woodland birds, especially in Australia. But she's very active as a policy person, as a person who's engaged with government and with different agencies involved in land use and also with the broader public. You'll often see writings that Martine does in venues like The Conversation, other things like that. She's really engaged, she's very plugged in, and she spends a lot of time doing the hard lifting, the heavy lifting that a lot of us scientists don't really like to do, which is things like evaluating environmental impact assessments, looking at carbon offsets, other types of things. Biodiversity offsets are one of her big things. She won't be talking to us about that today. She did last time she was here. We worked at it, was a few years ago, BC, before COVID. So anyway, Martine, her lab works in Africa, they work in Latin America, of course they work here in Australia, and they are a very engaged and plugged in group, and we're really happy to have them here talking to us today. So thank you, Martine.
Super, thank you. Wow. Thank you for the introduction. I feel very inadequate, bookended by such spectacular speakers, but at least you guys are getting everyone in the mood to hear about birds, which as Phil says, I'm going to talk about birds today, which is a bit different from what I was talking about last time I was here. That said, if anybody is really disappointed by that news and still wants to ask me things about biodiversity offsetting, I'm happy to answer. So look, thank you, Bill. Thanks, Yoko, for inviting me up here. Really cool to have this audience, which I'm gathering is from not just inside of JC, but the community more broadly. So hopefully I'm going to touch on some things that are of interest. How many people are into birds in this audience? Good, that's what I like to see. And everyone else, what's wrong with you? Like, but especially being based up here, I've just spent the most amazing few days actually. I was lucky enough on the weekend to go and join the crane count on the Atherton Tableland, which is run by BirdLife Northern Queensland, which was an amazing event, really incredible. And then nip up to the Cape to see the golden-shouldered parrots. And yeah, it's just, this is just such a great part of the world. I don't get here often enough. I'm not really going to be talking that much about the birds of this part of the world though. And I'd be really interested though to hear people's reflections on the things that I do talk about, our woodland, particularly our subtropical and temperate woodland bird communities, and how similar and different the sorts of things that I talk about are to the tropical woodland zone, which I know so little about. And driving around the last few days, I spent a lot of time trying to connect where the similarities and sort of differences were. So I hope I get a chance to chat to you about this local patch, birdwise, at the end of the talk. Weirdly for me, I'm going to start to talk about the mammals, not birds, which is not anything I actually know anything about. So one of the conservation failures for which Australia is really infamous is its record of mammal extinctions. This is a paper by John Winarski and colleagues, and it's actually a few years out of date now. The line, of course, has continued to go up. We've managed to wipe out 34 mammal species, mainly due to the early introduction of foxes and cats, but, you know, more recently, other causes that have caused the loss of the bramblecue melanis and the Christmas Island pipistrelle. These are really sad stories that I know that you're probably really familiar with. So the point, I guess, is that these extinctions, you know, they weren't sort of all historic. It wasn't the thylacine and that was sort of it. They've just kept going. The really interesting thing is that it's not just the extinctions, the complete extirpation from the face of the planet that we're seeing that's changed the mammal fauna here so much. It's also extirpations from large parts of their former range. So even the species that remain extant in one part of the world are often really reduced in that range that they occupy. And we see this with so many of our mammals. And there's a lot of work going on trying to reintroduce the missing mammals to parts of, you know, to fenced sanctuaries and so on, where the predator pressure can be controlled better, you know. But what we've lost here are the ecosystem functions that these species used to drive right across large parts of the continent. So we've lost the top predators. You know, we've lost the dispersers of symbiotic fungi that our plants require to thrive. We have lost the ecosystem engineers that turn the soil over and help maintain a healthy and open soil structure. So the point is that when we go and look at ecosystems that superficially look structurally intact, because the vegetation is still there, they're functionally really profoundly changed in a lot of parts of Australia. And because we don't really have solutions to a lot of these declines. And in many cases, the species really are completely extinct. We're really looking at landscapes that we can never repair. These are functions we can't actually put back again. And it's really interesting to contrast that story with the story of our birds. And that story, when we look at the mainland bird population, thankfully, it's actually a really different story, because we've, well, probably lost only one, or at least it's recorded that we've only lost one mainland full species of bird since European colonisation, the paradise parrot, which was lost from, well, the area sort of to the west of where I'm normally based, you know, southern central inland Queensland there. And it was lost probably for a variety of reasons, grazing, which, you know, has reduced its food source, but also people used to collect the termite mounds that it used to make its nest hollows in to make tennis courts, of all things. Now, the golden-shouldered parrot that I was just looking at up on the Cape is another one of another species from this same genus, and it is facing the same fate if we don't do something. So the fact that we've only recorded one full species lost from mainland Australia doesn't imply that all is well. In fact, 38 species nationally listed as threatened, and 216 distinct taxa if we look at distinct subspecies and so on. So this was really outlined in the update of the 2020 Action Plan for Australian Birds, which was launched by Stephen Garnett and Barry Baker as editors, with contributors from right across Australia, you know, over 300 different contributors, to evaluate what's going on with all of our different bird taxa. And it really sets out the scale of the challenge that we have. And things on the whole are getting worse. This book has, the action plans have been done for several decades now. Each 10 years basically shows a worsening story. So there are stories of hope in this book. Some recoveries where, particularly for island species, where there's been eradication and management of introduced species, and things have recovered, and that's great. But for our mainland birds, things are not going well. Many species have been uplisted, and there's a whole range of factors behind that, but it was certainly helped along by the severe bushfires of 2019-2020. So again, we're looking at a whole suite of species that are threatened with extinction, not necessarily, well, not completely extinct yet, but we're already seeing the effects of the loss, their loss from large parts of their former range. So most of these species are threatened because they have contracted not only in abundance, but also in areas where they occur. And so this is some work that was done by Michelle Ward that maps out of our threatened taxa. So going back to taxa here, so all the species and subspecies that are listed as nationally threatened on the Australian mainland, where did they used to occur and where do they no longer occur? So what places already have lost these species, even if the species still exists somewhere? So this is a really interesting task that Michelle took on of documenting this extirpation using scientific literature, historical sources, and expert elicitation to map the historical extent of the 72 of Australia's most imperiled terrestrial birds, and then compare this with their current known distribution. And so she found that since European colonisation, through a combination of range contractions and the loss, just the complete destruction of potentially suitable habitat, about 78% of threatened birds have been extirpated from more than half of their original ranges. So even without those species becoming extinct, that's already a tragedy of local extinctions in many, many places. There's probably about 10 taxa that have been lost from more than 99% of their original ranges. So we're really talking about functional extinction for many of these species. And the thing to note in this map is, I guess, sorry, I should have said this at the start, essentially the warmer the colour, the redder the colour, the more species have been lost from that area. So it's stacking all the maps of local loss, just for the 70 odd species that she looked at, taxa that she looked at. You can see that the area where there's been the greatest number of species lost from any one place is in the eastern sort of woodland zone. And there's no prizes for guessing why. we have seen the most substantial transformation of our landscapes and loss of habitat in this zone. So this is a map of the pre-colonisation extent of native vegetation in Australia. Ignore the different shades of green. The point is the green is essentially wooded vegetation. And this is the area where we see the most local extirpations of birds, and this is what the clearing pattern looks like. So all of that white is essentially woody vegetation that is no more, that has been totally converted for human land uses, and basically none of those species are able to inhabit those areas. So it's not very surprising when you compare these images that, of course, these are areas from which huge numbers of species have been extirpated. And even that doesn't tell a full story, because then we're only looking at threatened species. What about all species? Because every hectare that is cleared, it extinguishes potential habitat for a whole suite of species. So this is work that was done by Jeremy Simmons, and this is something that I sort of had a bit of an idea for one day when we have a farm in Western Victoria, and this is a really transformed landscape. There's not much native vegetation left. And I remember sort of stepping into into the outdoor laundry, feeling, because I'd been spending so much time in Queensland, suddenly thinking, oh, I'd better be careful of snakes. And then remembering, no, the snakes are gone. There used to be tiger snakes through here, but no more. They're gone from this whole landscape. Now, that's not a species that's listed as threatened, and it probably never will be, but it has been extirpated from huge parts of its range. And it got me thinking, well, what fraction of birds have been extirpated from what fraction of their range, you know? And many of these things are not actually threatened, but it's telling a story of multiple local extirpations. So again here, so this is a piece of work that Jeremy Simmons led that mapped out every hectare of habitat destruction across Australia and all of the bird species that would have occupied that area based on their range and their habitat associations, essentially. And so the redder here, the more species, this goes up to 187. So a clearing of a hectare, it's not just clearing of a hectare, and it's not just important because it might be koala habitat. It's actually reducing the available habitat that over 100 species in most of these cases, over 150 in most of the woodland zone, can occupy. So it's really not surprising that we're starting to see woodland bird declines right across the board when we look at a map like this. This is a woodland that I worked in back during my honours and my PhD. And I was really, back when I was working in these woodlands, I was really inspired by work by people like Harry Recker and Hugh Ford and Julian Reed and Jeff Barrett and all these guys who were documenting this really scary blinking out of woodland birds from landscapes and even from patches of remaining habitat like this. They were basically describing the paying of an extinction debt, where we were having losses even in landscapes where the land clearing had long ceased. And that's something that I don't need to explain to many people in this room. But I was really interested in these little patches in Western Victoria because they actually still supported a lot of these birds. So, you know, guys like this Rufus Whistler and red-cap robin and yellow thornbill, these are the classic sort of drier woodland species from the sort of subtropical and temperate woodland zones. And they're also the species that since the 90s, we've known to have been undergoing population declines. So the fact that they were still occurring in these patches, I was quite excited by. The problem is of course, that none of these species, the presence of these species in these patches wouldn't trigger any special protections at all. You know, the fact that they were really important for a whole suite of declining woodland birds sort of doesn't really count because none of them were listed as formally threatened species. So if someone did want to come and clear some of this habitat, you don't have that trigger, that in to say, hang on a minute, this is really important habitat because it doesn't tick an important box. And so this is what's gotten me thinking about how we need to shift the way we think about our faunal assemblages, the whole community of fauna that make up the things that make woodland tick, I suppose. Threatened species lists just don't tell us the full story, and they don't even tell us most of the story. You know, most of what we're losing when we lose a hectare of habitat will never trigger any requirement to be assessed through an environmental impact assessment. They will never trigger that sort of scrutiny that you get. Instead, we have this whole syndrome of essentially a whole faunal community unraveling through, innumerable local extirpations, particularly in this case of our smaller-bodied songbirds, so particularly of our passerines, and leaving behind an avifauna that's really shifted functionally, sort of dominated by things like larger parrots and carnivores and things like that. So the work that our group's been doing has really started to focus on this woodland bird community as a whole, as a distinct and recognisable entity, just like a recognised plant community that's got a name, that might be able to be assessed as whether it meets criteria for being threatened or not, and protected and managed as an entity rather than just as individual species and only interesting if one happens to be threatened with complete extinction from the face of the planet. That's not what conservation is about. It's not about making sure that we still have an example of each species left somewhere on the planet, somewhere. That's not what we're about. That's a part of it. But surely the idea is to actually maintain healthy functioning ecological communities, wherever we can, making sure that all of our ecosystems still support and are supported by the full gamut of birds that belong there. And the reason I started with the mammals is that it's sort of too late for us to do that with our mammal community. We've really butted that up because we've sent so many of them extinct, and those that remain, we have so little control over how, we're never going to be able to gain wide-scale control over things like the predators that are keeping their numbers low and causing the extirpation from large parts of the landscape. Even if we can do something, actually returning that sort of function to the whole landscape is almost beyond our reach, but we can do it for birds. So if we start to think about bird communities and conservation of entire communities, it's not too late for us to keep and recover almost all of our birds. This is what it should sound like when we actually have this community functioning. And I'm rather surprised, it's the very first time that button has ever worked for me. But this sound system in this place is miraculous. I don't even know where the microphone is that it's working. Okay, so obviously the idea of protecting ecological communities as opposed to just individual species is not a new idea. We actually do that already. And, there's been a lot of work in recent years over international frameworks to achieve that through the Red List of ecosystems. And in Australia, since the EPBC Act, since the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act has existed, we have listed ecological communities as threatened entities. So we actually do have the policy tools available to do what I think is necessary. It just requires thinking a little bit differently about how we use them. So what about considering faunal communities as entities requiring formal legal protection, like ecological communities? The thing is that if you actually look at the Red List of ecosystems and you look at the ecosystems assessed so far, or if you go on and look at the list of EPBC Act listed ecological communities, there's about 100 of them. Almost every one is a community that is described based on the plants. And in the description, it'll probably mention the fauna that are there. But in most cases, it is essentially a plant story. And we know that it is, you're not necessarily going to capture the loss of the fauna by looking at the plants. Look at the mammal example. The plant community may still be there, apparently structurally intact, but the mammals can be missing. So we know that it's really important. We've known this is really important to think about for a long time. Ever since Kent Redford wrote in this seminal paper, The Empty Forest, that we must not let a forest full of trees fool us into believing that all is well. Because threatened ecological communities are not just plants, because a loss of functioning fauna communities can occur before any change in plant communities are detectable, and faunal loss can in turn drive the collapse of entire ecosystems. Now, in the case of Australia's woodland birds, we know that there are places that can seem structurally really intact, but have completely transformed and essentially degraded and simplified bird communities. I'm going to talk about why in a minute. And the flip side, I was working in those tiny little fragments of bull oak woodland in Western Victoria. They were really degraded. Often they were just sort of trees and grazed grass, and that was all that was left. But those were of huge value for the woodland bird assemblages. So protecting plant communities as umbrellas for bird conservation just isn't going to be enough. So essentially, to be able to evaluate something as a threatened ecological community, you need to be able to sort of define and quantify it so that you can assess it against the criteria. And so a few years ago, a group of us, led by Hannah Fraser, and again working with Jeremy Simmons and Alex Cutt, we decided to sort of see if we could formalise the definition of a woodland bird community, which is something that bird people obviously talk about all the time. But can we come to an agreement amongst all of us about what is and isn't this woodland bird community, and what constitutes a good condition version of it versus a poor condition version of it? So our working hypothesis was that really woodland bird experts across Australia did have a pretty similar idea of what they meant when they referred to the woodland bird community. So we just had to get it out of their brains. And so we drew on over 70 experts, with expertise in woodland bird communities right across Australia, to try to identify first the species that we meant. And this wasn't necessarily individual species, but taxa that were pretty typically in every community. So for example, in a woodland in the temperate and subtropical zones, whether you're talking about Tasmania or WA or the subtropics here in Queensland or even South Australia, a good condition version of this community ought to have some of your pouncing robins and things, some finches, some granivores, but not a lot. Some type of babblers, some fairy wrens, for example, bark gleaners, satellas, some type of tree creeper. Species will vary. Some foliage gleaning things, thornbills, gerygonies, that sort of stuff. Small, medium, and large honeyeaters, not just large honeyeaters, as well as your sort of carnivores, scavengers, nectivorous parrots and so on, and aerial insectivores. So, you really should have this whole profile. The taxonomic profile is actually quite similar, even if there are species level substitutions. So we were able to get consensus on that, and everybody was quite happy about which species were in and which species were out. And we were also then able to use this group of experts to essentially do an online survey to judge community condition. So to do this, we presented our experts with a series of survey results from 2 hectare, 20-minute surveys. So standardized survey method, and then ask the experts to judge the condition of the community just based on that unit. And that's important because we want to be able to then go out and use this index to calculate the condition of real communities using real methods. So it's not about trying to work out all of the species that should be in a site and then what fraction of them, are there to tell you the condition, because we will never know that. The more you survey, the more you will find. What we need to know is when we go out to a site that's really good condition, on average, what should we find? And the other thing we needed to do was to actually identify the different subregions. So I mentioned that there was sort of often species or even genus level sort of substitutions from place to place, and we wanted to reflect that. So we were able to get consensus from the experts as well on 6 different subregions. So we felt that there were small differences amongst 2 of the WA variants of the community, the sort of South Australian, southeastern mainland and subtropical, and the Tasmanian entity for this community. I mentioned the online survey. The online survey was really interesting because what came out of it was essentially a sort of a statistical description of condition, which turned out to be really similar amongst all those 6 variants. So essentially the same metric worked for all of them. So even though we did identify these, by describing it not on the basis of the particular species that are there, but on the sort of functional attributes, we were able to come up with a generalizable metric. And that then meant that we were able to look at the criteria for listing as threatened under the EPBC Act for a threatened ecological community, and evaluate how our bird assemblages were looking. We did this separately for the 6 communities. And the criteria sort of range from things like decline in geographic distribution, small geographic distribution and ongoing threat, loss of functionally important species, reduction in community integrity. So we basically needed to map both extent and condition to be able to do this. And this is what we concluded. We actually concluded that all 6 of the variants are eligible, meet the criteria for listing as critically endangered, in fact, on the basis of the rate of continuing detrimental change, a combination of both loss of area, places where no woodland birds can live anymore because there is no woodland, and that the rate of change over time, combined with ongoing declines in the community condition judged by our experts. So I'll talk very briefly about that loss of extent, and then we'll talk a bit about what's driving the loss of condition in what remains, because those two factors together are what's driving, are causing the threats to this community. So first of all, I've already touched on with those maps that one of the most important drivers of this decline, which is of course land clearing. So if Australia is famous for mammal extinctions, it's also infamous for land clearing. It's probably one of very few, hard to think of another wealthy nations that engage in just so much habitat destruction, including old growth forests and woodland. And so this graph might be familiar to you, those of you who sort of follow this. This is showing the rate of land clearing over time, just in Queensland, the state that does the most land clearing, although New South Wales is doing its best to catch up more recently. So the dark green shows the amount of clearing of remnant vegetation over time, and the light green shows sort of re-clearing of regrowth vegetation over time. And so it starts from 2000, runs through to 2017, 2018. We've got more recent data than that. I haven't plotted it here because they have changed the way that they derive the data. But if I did plot it here, it would be back up around here. So it's gone up again. Problem is we don't know quite how much of that going up again is due to more clearing and how much is due to the methodological differences. So that's why I've left it off. But I guess the point there is we haven't fixed this problem yet. As you can see, it looked like we maybe had. There was a huge spike with hundreds of thousands of hectares of remnant being cleared in the early 2000s. That was in the lead up to the Peter Beattie-led end to broad-scale land clearing in Queensland, with some clearing continuing through the ballot system, where the last certain amount of broad-scale land clearing and conversion was permitted. Down to this period between about 2008 and 2011, where land clearing was still occurring and there was still clearing of remnant forest and woodland, but it was brought down to historically low levels. Does anyone remember what happened after that? There was an election. and a different mob got in, who shall remain nameless. And they signalled pretty quickly that they weren't going to prosecute illegal land clearing, and they were going to look real quick at what they could do to relax the regulations around native vegetation protections. And as you can see, they did, and that was effective. Even when the next government, the Labor government, got in, they did not have control of Parliament, so they couldn't actually pass the legislation to reverse those relaxations of regulations. And so land clearing continued to increase. Now they do, and they have introduced legislation that's meant to reduce the amount of land clearing, but whether it's been effective seems to be a pretty open question at this point. In fact, I'd argue that largely it hasn't been, because what the exact drivers are, well, it was a really complex problem. The situation is, though, that we're still seeing, up to 100,000 hectares or more of old growth of remnant vegetation being cleared. And that is obviously a huge impact for woodland birds. So that's one part of the story. Normally I talk a lot about that, but I'm actually not going to talk that much about that. I'm going to talk about what is going on in the habitat that hasn't been cleared. Because when I moved to Queensland, I was really excited to start working in these really extensive forests in the Brigalow Belt. So some of those big forests through the Carnarvon Ranges, where there were very extensive areas of unfragmented habitat. That was exciting for me because I worked in a really fragmented habitat for my PhD. And I thought, right, well, this is going to be great. These forests are going to be just full of birds. It'll be wonderful. But they weren't. This was, it was the opposite of what I saw. Some of these areas had more degraded, in fact, I would say most of the areas where I surveyed had more degraded bird assemblages than the really structurally degraded little patches of woodland in Western Victoria. And, one of the causes of this was, of course, that these forests, they're not all conservation areas, and even the ones that are, still suffer from, quite intensive livestock grazing, from domestic and feral cattle, and also horses in some of these areas. So obviously part of that effect is that the structure of the vegetation becomes really simplified, the ground layer is damaged, and so on. So there's a loss of habitat structural complexity. Combined with this is the introduction of a lot of pasture grasses, which are very, very good at invading into woodlands that historically did not have a very grassy understory. So buffel grass is a key one. There's been a lot of work developing different variants of buffel grass, and buffel grass now, different variants of buffel grass are really good at growing in underneath trees, even relatively dense areas that wouldn't normally have been very susceptible to fire. Now with buffel grass, fire can get into places that didn't used to be able to get into, and it can burn hotter. So brigalow forest, for example, which is not a fire-resistant ecosystem, is being degraded through the combination of weed invasion and the fires that weed invasion carries into those ecosystems. So all of these things are essentially simplifying the structure of these ecosystems, opening them out, reducing the complexity of the understory, and coupled with climate change that's increasing the severity and duration of drought, as well as the frequency of extreme fire weather days. All of these things combined are creating this incredible change to habitat structure. Despite all of this, the habitat structure change itself isn't even the biggest factor here, but it causes what I think is the biggest factor here. And that's this guy, noisy miners. So this, I should say at the outset, I have a lot of respect for noisy miners. They're a wonderful bird. They're very attractive. Look at that face. And they have the most remarkable social structures, which I'll talk about in a sec. But this is a huge threat to other woodland birds. So this is a native bird, occurs throughout the eastern woodland zone of Australia. And it's really one of the most unusual honeyeaters that you'll meet, because despite its name, it's not primarily a nectarivore. It feeds on certainly carbohydrate resources, but mostly the sugary sort of lerf secreted by psyllid insects, as well as just insects through leaf gleaning and so on. And because of that, it can be sedentary. So most of our honeyeaters move around to wherever the food resources are, but this guy doesn't. They're able to set up and establish territories in any suitable habitat, and they dominate those territories behaviourally, and it's really, really remarkable. So this was behaviour that was first described in the 1970s by the amazing Douglas Gow, now late, who did just the most incredible study to pull apart what was going on with the social lives of these guys. So they have this really sophisticated hierarchical social structure with these colonies that could be, hundreds or maybe even thousands of birds, basically stretching across huge areas of woodland, like I saw in the Carnarvon Ranges. And then these colonies are made up of smaller social groups called coteries, in which birds cooperate to defend their part of the colony's territory. And in some cases, they'll join with birds from other coteries to chase away really significant threats like raptors and so on, but not just potential predators. So these birds also spend a lot of their time and energy physically chasing and attempting to directly exclude pretty much every other bird species, not all, but almost all. And they succeed against any bird species that's about their size or smaller, just like all bullets, right? They pick on those that are smaller. And it's a fascinating strategy, and it's one that takes a lot of energy. And so to do that really effectively, it's best that you've got a really simplified woodland structure, so that first of all, when you're scanning your territory, you can easily see any intruders, so you don't have to be constantly patrolling. And if you do find an intruder and you want to chase them out, it's much easier to exclude them. So hard to prove that that's exactly what's going on, but it seems like a plausible explanation for me. One way or another, they love open habitat structure. And that's what we've given them through grazing, through inappropriate fire regimes, and through climate change, which is causing increased drought. And in the habitats that are still quite structurally dense, we've created a whole lot of edges with nice open habitat adjacent, so they can live on the edges of those habitats. So they're not intrinsically an edge species, which you do sort of see them characterised as, but in habitat that isn't it's self-suitable, that's where they'll occur on edges. But as I say, in the Carnarvon Ranges, they are happily at the highest densities of anywhere I've seen in Australia, 20, 30 kilometres from the nearest edge. And they're actually increasing their occupancy. So they're not really expanding their range. So they're still in, this would have been the approximate original range as far as we know of noisy miners. I don't really hear anybody talking about them moving outside of this range. They've got their cousins, the yellow-throated miners, outside of that range, probably doing that job for them, but we actually don't know that much about that. So if anyone wants to work on yellow-throated miners, it'd be good to talk. But within their range, they are just occupying more and more of the woodland that is left. So all of these sort of darker coloured patches, only the very lightest colour here were areas where they weren't sort of increasing in their reporting rate based on a bioregion by bioregion basis. So all of these darker areas are areas where they're becoming more common. So they're really increasing the areas that they're dominating. So you can see this perfect storm for woodland birds. Less and less woodland, more and more damage to the woodland that remains, and invasion by things that want to chase them away. And so because of this, there's been a lot of work done on noisy miners, and they've been called a lot of rude names, including by me. They've been called despotic, overabundant, hyper-aggressive, reverse keystones, bullies, and the enemy. So, you know, they are an amazing bird, but they really are a really big part of this problem, especially for those small and medium-sized songbirds that are such a key part of the woodland bird assemblage and that are declining in so many parts of Australia. So this figure gives an example of just how pronounced their impact on smaller birds is. So these are the modelled effects of increasing noisy miner density on the proportion of the birds at a site that are small-bodied, like less than 60 odd grams body size, which is most of those small passerines that I'm talking about, as noisy miner density increases. So this is with data from about 300 sites across Australia. Each of the colours is just a different one of these regions, but you can see it's a really similar story no matter where you go. Essentially, in sort of a non-noisy miner occupied patch of woodland, you're expecting most of the birds, up to like 80–90% of the birds, to be small-bodied. But as soon as you get noisy miners, essentially the density of noisy miners is just a proxy for whether or not they've got a colony. So this is based on survey data. So, you know, once you're getting a few noisy miners per survey, chances are you're in a noisy miner colony and they're defending that colony, and it just drops away. So once you've got noisy miners, you're talking about less than 20% of your birds being small-bodied. It really shifts the whole avifauna. So there's a huge flow-on effect of these sorts of shifts. So this is an example of the effect on the richness of small birds. In this data set, all the coloured lines are actually different foraging guilds. But again, no matter, the point is they're all doing the same thing. This was some work that was actually, this analysis was led by Jim Thompson. And the idea was to try to identify whether there was a threshold density of noisy miners after which you got that depression of richness in the sites. And there is, but it's all the way back here. Like it's basically, I think it's 0.6 of a bird per hectare, which is, you know, it's not much. So this is what I mean. It's basically either you've got noisy miners and you've got a problem, or you don't. It's disrupted species abundance distributions enormously. So the species abundance distributions within sites with noisy miners are really flat with a big spike of noisy miners. And this graph just sort of shows the ordered, you know, each dot along here is one species ordered from lowest to highest abundance. The black squares just show that abundance of that species in a site that doesn't have noisy miners or is below that threshold we just talked about. And then the corresponding open square is the abundance of that site, of that species in sites that do have noisy miners. So you can see for almost every species, the average abundance drops down enormously, even for the really quite abundant species. And there's only a couple of weird little exceptions. I don't know if anyone wants to guess what they are. They're really quite odd, and I don't understand it. One of them is mistletoe bird, which, you know, it rings true. You do see them. Maybe it's because they're just so mobile and they're flying about from treetop to treetop and they're happy and they're gone real quick. and they get away with it, I don't know. And the other one is striated pardalate, which is strange because spotted pardalates are really susceptible. But for some reason, striated pardalates not so much. I don't know how that is. They seem so behaviourally similar. Maybe somebody will have an idea and tell me. Of course, as you can imagine, this totally changes the foraging profile of what's going on. So small insectivores decline, and you get this essentially increase in large insectivores and carnivores, very notable when you obviously include noisy miners amongst those because they're so numerically dominant in those sites. But even if you pull them out of the data set, down here, so, I'm just realizing that my pointer is not pointing. No, that didn't work at all. Okay, the bottom one. You can see that there's still an effect. So large birds, even aside from noisy miners, you're basically getting an increase in vertebrate predators, so nest predators. Things like currawongs, butcherbirds. Again, you're seeing that all of the pieces of this puzzle are just making things really, really hard for small birds. Now, I guess the good news is that this phenomenon, as striking as it is actually recognised under legislation. So it's recognised as a key threatening process in New South Wales and in Victoria, and under the EPBC Act, which was some work that some of those graphs helped to achieve through a really excellent working group of experts on noisy miners around about 10 years ago. So, it's listed as a key threatening process. What are we doing about it? What can we do about it? And this is sort of where we're falling over a bit. We're not really achieving implementation much. But we do know some of the things based on what facilitates noisy miner or what correlates with noisy miner occupancy of the site. Some things that we might be able to do. So obviously, it would be good to stop creating edges where there aren't any. So clearing a whole lot of land so that you've got edges in areas of previously intact vegetation, particularly if that's sort of denser structure vegetation that doesn't already have noisy miners in it, that is a bad thing to do. We should not be introducing new edges, obviously. Okay, well, revegetation is good, but a lot of revegetation ends up dominated by noisy miners, especially if it's eucalypts, because they like eucalypts, and it's, planted at a reasonably open sort of a density. You'll just get noisy miners. So if you revegetated with really, really dense vegetation, that could be useful. Obviously, it's a lot more expensive and time-consuming to do that. Long-armed bird patches are really good, where they get really dense and, you look at them and you might think, oh, that needs a fire through it. But actually, for the birds, could we not put a fire through it, please? Instead, what we probably want to do is manage our fire regimes to protect those long-armed bird patches in these landscapes. Reducing grazing, that's a useful thing to do. It turns out they quite like, open, sort of grazed out ground layers, but on its own, not really enough to kick the noisy miners out. Non-eucalypt species, revegetate with those. Now, obviously up here, there's lots of options for that, but you also don't have the same noisy miner issues. Further south, often it's just not an option. You're not in an area where any of the naturally occurring ecosystem types are non-eucalypt. But if you are, if you can revegetate with cypress pine or any casuarinas or aloe casuarinas, philodendron acacias. So if you're in any of those systems where you can, I should say, like where I am in southeast Queensland, we have dry rainforest, which is a type of semi-evergreen vine thicket, which actually has a lot of the same species you find in rainforests up here, only they're short. But non-eucalypts. So that was great. When I moved to Queensland, I was like, fantastic, I've got this opportunity to plant all these non-eucalypt things. And that's what we've done on our block. And it's been good. We don't have noisy miners anymore. People think we're mad because everybody there wants to plant eucalypts because koalas, right? I'm like, there's enough people dealing with koalas. What about the birds? Okay, but there is one other option, of course. This is what we do with other species that are considered pests. We cull them. Well, we're not going to be able to do all of these different actions in most places, to be honest. Mostly these are options for really quite small areas. What are we going to do about these vast areas of woodland that are currently occupied by noisy miners? We have to do something a bit dramatic if we actually want to open up space for woodland birds. Is it not worth looking at? Well, it turns out that actually quite a few people have looked at this as an option. And in fact, it quietly goes on as a management option in quite a few properties once you start looking into it. People don't tend to talk about it a lot. I think that it gets quite a reaction when you start talking publicly about essentially just killing large numbers of a native species in its original range. Think of the kerfuffle every time we talk about doing, kangaroo culls and things like that, even though it goes on. So, it's stressful. But there is evidence to suggest that it can be effective, and that's the important thing. So the original work led by Maron Gray back in the 90s did some culls in small woodland remnants in Victoria, really rapidly removed the miners, and 15 years later, in some of those sites, I hadn't come back, which is weird. I mean, we don't get that sort of reaction with anything else that we're trying to cull, with any of our invasive species. So there have been a few stories of, a potentially quick win and effective intervention. So that's cool. But not every removal intervention that's been documented has achieved such clear-cut results. So it sort of muddies the water, and you sort of want to feel pretty confident about the intended effect if you are going to start, killing large numbers of any animal, really, but perhaps especially a native animal. So I wanted to give you one example of a removal experiment that I was involved with to give you an idea about how perplexing this situation is. Because I hope I've painted the picture that this is a really big problem and we need a solution to it, but it's really been hard to get to the bottom of. So this is some work that was led by, it was an experiment set up by Paul McDonald at UNE and Richard Major with the Australian Museum. And the first half of it was led by my honours student, Galen Dunnett, and also Kim Morte did a lot of the surveys. I need to say all that because I really feel like I've been very peripheral in this experiment. I'm not presenting it really as my work. I had a small role. Now, in this experiment, the idea was that what we wanted to do is get to the bottom of why culls sometimes worked and why they did, other times they didn't seem to work. So we took a whole lot of sites, 24 sites that had different sort of landscape contexts, 30 to 40 hectares each in 2 different parts of New South Wales. And essentially half of these sites were randomly selected for noisy miner removal. And the noisy miners were removed by trained shooters using shotguns. And bird surveys were done before and after to see what happened. So far, so simple. Now, it was a really big job. So this is one of the patches, and every one of those markers was a bird that was removed during the first cull. Like, that's a lot of birds. So in the end, there were I think, over 3,000 birds removed from these sites. So this is not a small task. However, it's actually quite easy to do. It only took a day and a half per site. So as far as a conservation intervention goes, if that's all you have to do, that's actually pretty cheap and cost effective, right? Okay, so what do we find? Let's look at what happened to noisy miner numbers themselves first. So before the removal, they were similar in density between the control and the treatment sites, the removal sites. Now, after removing, and basically the shooters went until essentially there was maybe 1 or 2 birds that they couldn't get, but almost every bird was removed from the site. So a couple of weeks later, went back and did a survey. What happened? Nothing. There's still just as many birds there afterwards. How is that possible? There are that many birds in these landscapes that at the sites where the removals were done, there was no difference in the noisy miner density after taking out thousands of birds. It's just amazing. So that did our heads in a bit, because we're like, okay, well, our experiment isn't going to work, right? We're trying to work out why does it sometimes work, why does it sometimes not work. It didn't work at all in any site, so it's not going to tell us anything really. But we did think, okay, well, why not put the effort in and actually do one follow-up cull? Maybe that's an important thing. We've put all this, sunk cost in, and all these birds that have been sacrificed to the cause. We want to make sure we get the most out of this intervention. So we got approval to do one follow-up. What happened after that one? Well, I mean, the number of birds dropped, but they also dropped in the control sites. So at this point, it was just, okay, well, I guess this isn't going to work, and it's going to be an interesting lesson, but it sort of looks like a total failure across the board. Of course, we did look, though, at the small bird richness. And when we looked at that, we thought, well, that's really weird, because the small bird richness actually went up in the removal sites at the same time as it went down in the control sites, really only after the second cull, but it was a significant effect. So that's odd, because this is not a pattern you would ever find in a natural site, in an unmanipulated site. They just don't do this. Something different is going on here to have that density of noisy miners but that richness of small birds. Even more obvious when you look at the small bird density. So it really did go up, even though we're talking about small numbers. So very interesting, but at this point, Galen led the paper and we published, and we essentially concluded in that paper, well, this probably won't last. What's probably happening is that these noisy miners with their amazing sophisticated social systems are still sorting themselves out. They're probably arguing with one another. They're not focused on or not organised enough to exclude these intruders. And over time, they will get organised, and this will be a temporary benefit. Yes?
What is the time frame?
Yeah, okay, sorry. So these post, okay, so let me see if I can remember exactly. I think the surveys were done within a couple of weeks of the culls, the 2 post-survey culls. And the culls were done around about 6 months apart, or less than 6 months apart. Maybe it was 4 or 5 months apart, and I should have looked at that before I came and spoke, sorry. Hopefully it's in the paper. So yeah, good question. Anyway, but the even weirder thing, which isn't published yet, is what happened after that, because we kept going back for another 18 months to do more bird surveys. And when I say we, I mean that Paul and Richard and Kim went back. Sorry, I wish I'd been able to get down there. And the difference became more pronounced. We didn't do anything else. We didn't, I swear, we did not touch them again. But the noisy miners continued to decline at the removal sites. And at the same time as they actually were increasing at the control sites. So maybe the birds moved over there. So very, very strange. So this is like a delayed effect. What about the small birds though? Same, it was sustained, and in some cases got more pronounced. So here's another example with the small bird density. So we actually had these weird delayed and sustained effects from these culls, you know, even up to almost 2 years later. We obviously need to keep going back, but this is not what we expected. So the whole thing's extremely confusing. I don't know any of the answers. This is Courtney Melton, who's just finished a PhD with me, and one of the things that she spent her time doing was trying to collate all the instances of noisy miner culls from all different contexts that she could and reanalyze them to see, are there any patterns here? Can we try to make sense of this? Because this is a really tantalizing opportunity when we might have something that's effective and cost effective that we can do to help these small woodland birds. We need to know when it works. Frustratingly, and I recommend this conversation article that Courtney wrote to you. It's just really interesting. Essentially, we still don't know. She couldn't find any patterns. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. It wasn't affected by the landscape context, by the ability of birds, miners or other birds to get to the patch. The scale, whether it was a really big cull or a really small cull, the method of culling, it was just really strange. But the really interesting thing she did find was, even in examples of culls that had been reported as failures, they were seeing the same sort of thing that we were seeing. They were actually seeing an improvement in what we're ultimately after, which is small bird increases in small bird abundance and species richness. So even what we were classing as failures might not actually be failures. So we have a lot more to do to actually understand this. And I think it's really worth the effort. Because if we can identify the situations when this tool can be used, then we could potentially really open up huge amounts of woodland bird habitat in a way that's even more effective and certainly a lot more cost effective than getting out and replacing the habitat. The habitat's there, it's not accessible to so many species. We could make it accessible, but we just don't quite know how yet. So the final thing that I wanted to talk about though is that obviously the woodland bird community is facing, a huge number of pervasive and very interacting threats. And I hope that you agree that these sorts of phenomena are why we need to start thinking about bird conservation as a community level problem, not just a species conservation problem, and not just a habitat conservation problem, right? Either of those things on their own won't lead us to the solutions that we need. But if we are going to start focusing on whole communities, then we do need to be able to describe and measure them, sort of like I was talking about with the woodland bird community. So in that example, we were able to use a simple condition index for woodland birds to evaluate the status of the whole community. Oh, and I should have said back then when I put that slide up that we didn't just do the analysis and publish it. We prepared a nomination for this ecological community as a threatened ecological community under the EPBC Act. Gosh, that was like 6 or 7 years ago now. And we just keep being told we don't have the resources this year. We don't have the resources this year. It's sitting there, and we have no reason to believe that the nomination isn't essentially compliant, like meets the criteria. We're just going to keep on bashing our heads against that brick wall until something happens. But the point is, we were able to do the evaluation because we had this sort of an index. Now, an index of condition is going to be useful for a whole lot of different purposes too. Things like restoration practitioners who want to measure progress of the bird assemblages in restoration. You know, farmers who want to be able to make claims about their property and the biodiversity it supports. You know, there's a need for standardised and robust ways to measure and track our biodiversity. Most recently, you might have seen a couple of weeks ago, the federal government went out to very brief consultation on a biodiversity market, and they're going to issue certificates for projects that do good things, I gather. How that's all going to work is not yet clear, but whatever. All of these sorts of things require measurement. And we usually have pretty good metrics like this for community condition when we're talking about vegetation communities. So in Queensland, obviously, we've got like biocondition, you know, there's habitat hectares in Victoria. All of these things are sort of benchmarked to, you know, best condition for that vegetation type. And these are already used for tracking improvements in the context of restoration projects and stewardship schemes and biodiversity offsets and co-benefits from carbon projects and all sorts of things like that. But we don't have anything that tracks faunal community condition. And as I said, vegetation condition isn't necessarily a great proxy. But the good thing is for birds, we have heaps of data because birders like us are constantly wandering around and feeding the data into centralized databases like eBird and bird data. So we have the opportunity to create such metrics. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to skip past that. So this is Carlina Induswari. Carlina is a postdoc working on a project involving me and Golo and others, many others, Bush Heritage, Queensland Government, as well as BirdLife Australia, to draw on those data and on what's in the brains of experts to not just do a condition index for woodland birds, but to do one for every woodland bird community across Australia so that we could be tracking changes in condition. And with the amount of data that come in, you can hypothetically auto-calculate condition from every survey and then track at a national level how our bird communities are going. Wouldn't that be really cool? That's my dream. But of course, the first thing is we actually need to know what are the bird communities in Australia. Just like we do when we do a vegetation survey, we need to know, well, which regional ecosystem are we in? So that I can, you know, compare my survey results to the benchmarks for that regional ecosystem. We need to do the same for our bird communities. And of course, birdos talk about bird communities all the time by names, and we'd probably more or less agree on which ones are similar and different, but we need something that is sort of consistent and statistically describable. So Carlina is using bird data, 2 hectare, 20-minute bird surveys to do some clustering, run some clustering algorithms and identify which are the groupings that fall out. And it sounds simple to say it that way, but there's a lot of back and forth in making sure that we get it right, whether the right data have gone in and so on. I'll give you an example as to why in a minute. So to do this set of metrics for bird community condition, we need this definition of each bird community, and we need a list of attributes of the community. So just like if you're doing a biocondition thing, you will need information on things like, you know, the cover of different strata and fallen timber and maybe species richness and things like that from a defined survey area. We need to be able to do the same with our birds. And then we need to know what the benchmark values are for those attributes. In examples of that community, they're in like the reference state, what we're going to call best on offer. Because of course there is no correct answer to what is the pristine condition of a community. Communities are dynamic, we have shifting baseline syndrome. There are many, many reasons why we cannot know. Well, there is no answer. It is always a value judgment, what constitutes reference condition. But that's the case for plant communities too, and those guys have been getting along just fine. So we can do it for birds. So then finally, we just need a method to basically relate what we measure, the attributes of a site, in terms of the birds that are there, not the habitat, but the birds, to what we expect in a benchmark condition site. We know birds are really variable temporally, so we know we're going to need multiple samples, but that's okay, we can get around that. We can work out how many samples are necessary in a given area to give a representative impression of what the condition of that bird community is. So the really cool thing is that we're starting to get results, at least out of the regionalisation, the typology of different bird communities. And, at a very high level, we're seeing stuff that makes sense. So, we're seeing, the drier woodlands tending to cluster out. So these are just where the lists are that turned out in one of the bigger clusters. We're seeing arid zone clustering out, the tropical savannas clearly coming out, the wetter woodlands and forests of the southeast, and Tasmania, which comes up as very distinct. It's got a lot of endemics, and that makes sense. But, getting the boundaries clear and sharp and making sense is challenging, because you also have most of the surveys that are submitted don't have many birds on them, or they have, a magpie and a magpie lark and maybe a corvid on them. It doesn't tell you much, right? And that's because either, it was just an unlucky day, or because it was actually a degraded community, or it was a survey in somebody's backyard or whatever. So what we would love to do is to talk to people about these different communities and get some expert information fed into this process. So we're really keen to identify anyone who works in any of the distinct bird communities around Australia. Once we get the typology, we'd like to pick your brain and identify what you consider examples of reference condition, so that we can essentially develop these metrics. And I'm going to wrap it up there, because I've just realised how terribly over time I've gone. But thank you very much.